Hi, I'm Teresa Coenen with Stitch and Tree Quilts, and this is row 2 of our quilt, COVID Friends Tribute Quilt. Page 1 of your pattern has the cutting instructions and a story about how faith has been impacted by COVID. Page 2 of your pattern has the instructions for construction of the blocks, which we will go over in our video today. And page 3 of the pattern talks about why I chose the cross block to represent faith forever and a place for you to record your thoughts or just to reflect on either making the block or how COVID has impacted you and your faith. For block 4, Faith Forever, let's take a look at some fabric and your fabric options. The important part of the block is to make sure that you have good contrast between the center of the cross and the outside edges of the cross. You can use directional fabric, which I will show you, but if you choose to use directional fabric, you're going to want to pay attention to the direction that you're cutting the fabric. For example, in my Deep and Rich, I chose a fabric that I thought looked kind of like the striations of wood. And so I made sure that the fabric was going in the direction that it would need to go to be a piece of wood. In my Bright quilt, I have a directional background. This is a very difficult block to use for a directional background because you're using both quarter square triangles and half square triangles. And so it will be virtually impossible to get all of the fabric going the right direction unless you've cut your half square triangle on the diagonal. For my quilt, I'm choosing to have it look like a hodgepodge, and so this will work for me. The block itself is an excellent block to use to fussy cut the center. You can see here in my batik, I fussy cut the center of that very specifically to have kind of a Christian look. So it's a great place to fussy cut that. So for my fabrics that I chose for the 4 quilts that I have, for my bright batik with the black background, I chose a turquoise and a bright green. I have a blue and a rose, an orange and a turquoise in my batik. And in my bright, I chose this. You can go with any color. It's important to take a look at the other colors you've used in your row 1 blocks and see what colors you're missing. Or if there's a specific color that references your faith, your church, choose that so that the block has more meaning for you. The cutting instructions are fairly straightforward. I like to use a Marty Michelle 6.5-inch square up tool because it has very distinct 1/8 marks, and it makes it very easy for me to cut those 7/8 of an inch or 5/8 of an inch, and allows me to cut those very well. When it comes to cutting your quarter squares, triangles, and your half square triangles, keep in mind that you will not be using all of the pieces for this particular unit. So hang on to those, set them aside. You might use them for a future unit. Once I have cut my quarter square or half square triangles, I like to use a Marty Michelle template. You can use a corner tool. You can use any one of her half square units that have an engineered corner, and it allows me to trim those corners off of that piece, making it much easier for it to fit, as I'll show you in the video as we move forward. You'll be working with 4 different sizes of triangle units, quarter square triangles and half square triangles. So it's important that you keep them sorted by size. In the pattern itself, I will always tell you which size of a unit you'll be using. As I stated earlier, using directional background fabric can really be a challenge. As you can see here, my directions aren't going any certain direction, which is what I want from the overall look in my quilt. Where this can become problematic is if you want these to go a certain direction, in which case with your quarter square triangles, you would just continue to replace them with the ones that would work to make it go in the direction that you would choose to. That may work for your quarter square triangles, but your half square triangles would have to be cut on the diagonal in order for it to work out so that they're going the same direction as the other pieces. It's one of the reasons why I choose to have mine look very scrappy, and I am choosing to have all of my units venture out from the center. So I like to lay out my unit on a mat next to my machine so I can pick up the pieces and sew as I go. It doesn't hurt to take a picture with your camera or with your phone so that you have an image of what you want to have your finished block look like. That way you've got something to look at in case you get interrupted while you're putting your block together. Step 1 calls for you to use a 4 1/4 inch background quarter square triangle. That's the second largest size of quarter square triangles. So of your triangles, that's the second largest one, along with your small, this unit here, the small rectangle of the cross. And you'll match up the 90-degree angles with the rectangle, stitch a 1/4 inch. I have my corners engineered off. If you didn't, you would overlap 3/8 of an inch there, and then you would trim those dog ears. For pressing, I set the seam. It says to press to the outside. Then I finger press that to the outside and put my iron back on, holding for 5 seconds. I like to use a dry iron, a wet iron. A steam iron will introduce stretch into the unit, and since that unit is cut on the bias, it's important not to introduce stretch into that. So now I have my unit for step 1 pressed to the outside. Again, if you had not engineered your corners, you would need to go ahead and trim those dog ears. Step 2 requires that I take my small half square triangle and stitch it to the unit. Again, I have my corners engineered. If not, you would have a roughly 3/8 of an inch that it exceeds outside. Stitch that at a 1/4 inch. Once I have stitched that small half square triangle to the top of the unit, I'll set that seam and press to the outside. Holding that for 5 seconds. Step 3. Step 3 requires the use of the rectangles and the small center square. Step 3 requires that you press those seams towards the center. Again, I like to set the seam. I'll set the iron on my center unit and then flip it open, set the iron, and wait for 5 seconds. Turn my unit over, and I can do the very same thing again to the other side. Again, this is an opportunity for me to make sure that I keep my unit straight by pressing it straight. Step 4 requires that you stitch the 3 1/4 inch background quarter square triangles to your unit from step 3. You'll do that by matching the 90-degree angle corners of the unit. If you have not engineered your corners, these are going to extend roughly 3/8 of an inch over the edge. That's not a worry. You can trim those dog ears off later. On step 4, with those background units on the sides, you're to press to the outside. Again, you just set the seam, hold that in place for 5 seconds. Now the units from step 2 and step 4 are ready to be stitched together. On step 5, you will take the units from step 2 and step 4 and nesting those seams, you will stitch the 2 units together. I like to use a fork pin when I'm nesting seams. It's a 2-pronged pin that allows me to drop a pin on both sides of that seam. If I'm not going to use a fork pin, if I'm going to use a traditional pin, then I will pin it above the seam so that it is in the seam allowance, but above the seam, so that as it comes through my machine, it'll be before I get to the actual seam. At my machine, I'm just going to run that through at 1/4 of an inch. And first I'm approaching that fork pin. And as my needle goes through the seam allowance, before I get to the pin, I can pull the pin out. And because I had stopped in the seam allowance, it'll make sure those seams match up nice and tight. Now I'm headed for the pin that's just a regular pin. Same thing, I stop before the seam allowance and take the pin out. And finish stitching off the edge. I like to use the rest of my units for beginners and enders for the 9 patches. So it makes it that when I open it up, I know those seams are going to match up perfectly. The instructions on step 5 tell you to press the seam open. You can press the seam open or you can press it towards the top point. Either way will work just fine. Again, a nice hot iron and holding it in place will work quite nicely. Step 6 is identical to step 1, with the exception that you'll be using the large 1/4 square triangles and the long stem of the cross unit. Again, you will match up the 90-degree angles to stitch in place. And you'll set the seams and press to the outside. On step 7, you'll add that last half square triangle, the small half square triangle, along the bottom of the unit, 1/4 inch, and then press to the outside. Once I have the half square unit stitched on, I'll set that seam and press it to the outside. The unit is ready to stitch together. Step 8 calls for the 2 units to be stitched together. Because they've been pressed the direction that the pattern calls for, the seams will nest quite nicely. Again, I like to use a fork pin to hold those 2 pieces together, where the forks of the pin go on either side of the seam. And you can see that mine's going to match up quite nicely because my engineer corners end up coming out quite exact. I'll stitch those together and then we'll be ready to press. Step 8 calls for the unit to be pressed towards the bottom of the cross, so I'll set that seam just as I have with the smaller seams, lay the block open, and then press towards the bottom of the unit. Your unfinished square should measure 6.5 inches. And that's all we have for block 4, Faith Forever. If you have any questions along the way, give me a call, send me an email, do a post on our group Facebook page, and we'll get back to you as soon as we possibly can to answer any questions that you might have. I thank you for joining us and have a blessed day.